Javier Barrios, vicepresidente de la Sociedad Nacional de Industrias, quien va a moderar esta ronda de preguntas y respuestas y va a actuar como moderador de esta exposición central. Invitamos también a que suban a los panelistas: David Lemor, director de Asuntos Corporativos del Perú, ELNG; Mercedes Arauz, congresista de la República y segunda vicepresidenta; Juan Pablo Rivera, presidente de la Asociación de Zonas Francas de las Américas; Aldo Mariátegui, de Radioprogramas de Perú. Los invito por favor a tomar asiento aquí arriba en el estrado para que puedan escuchar desde acá la exposición. Muy bien, por supuesto que es un honor para todos nosotros tener hoy a Dani Rodrik, uno de los más importantes economistas políticos del momento. Es profesor Ford Foundation de Economía Política Internacional en la Escuela de Gobierno John F. Kennedy de Harvard. Dani Rodrik es experto pionero en la globalización y el desarrollo económico. Sus ideas de estrategia de crecimiento económico hechas a la medida local han tenido una gran influencia en gobiernos e instituciones multilaterales. Es autor de varios libros bestseller, entre estos Has Globalization Gone Too Far? El trilema de globalización de Rodrik se ha convertido en una referencia de discusión sobre el futuro de la economía mundial. Muy bien, entonces recibamos con un fuerte aplauso a Dani Rodrik.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's very, very nice to be here. It's always a pleasure to be here in Lima. I want to thank the University of Lima for hosting us, the Sociedad Nacional de Industria for the invitation and for holding this event. As I was listening to some of the discussions in the morning, I was very much, realizing that there is a sense of so many problems that the economy here and industry in particular has to fix, and so these intense discussions about what to do. And of course, I come to this country from the outside, seeing what a great success Peru has been. So to me, it's really the achievements of this country that really stand out. And I just wanted to say this at the outside, because sometimes when you're inside, just dealing with your own problems all the time, you tend to lose sight of the global context. And of course, the global context today, as you know, is not a very good one. You might think you have problems with the, president and the Congress fighting each other and the politics and all of that. But all you have to do is just read the international news or watch CNN to realize that this is sanity. This is pretty good compared to what's going on outside. So just a word of perspective to begin with in terms of the scale of problems that we're talking about. What I want to do in my presentation is talk a little bit about productivity, because ultimately productivity is everything. And I'll try to bring a couple of different perspectives on how we think about productivity, looking at the recent experience of Peru in that light. Since we're focusing on industry, I want to say a little bit about the role of manufacturing and provide a perspective on that. And then maybe spend the last bit of my presentation about what type of policies, what type of policy frameworks might assist both manufacturing industries and economy-wide productivity in Peru. I said that when an outsider comes to Peru, the first thing they notice is the success. What I have in mind is basically a picture like this. So in the next three pictures, I'm going to compare Peru through three comparators. I don't know if you can actually read what's on the legend of that picture, but the thick blue line is Peru, and I'm comparing it to advanced economies, the mature economies of the world. I'm comparing it to Latin America in general, the Latin American average, which is the green triangles, and also the emerging market and developing economies, which are sort of the purple line here, just below the blue. And if we index GDP, the level of GDP, to equal for all of these four groups of countries in 1990, this is when the series starts. And what you see, in fact, is that Peru really stands out. And that's quite an achievement in light of the fact that the purple line actually includes, of course, a big contributor there is China as well. So we have some tough competitors here. And taking that longer-term perspective, Peru actually has done very well in terms of GDP. This is the total size of the economy, total output. How does this relate actually to productivity? Well, GDP is made in a number of different ways. In order to get GDP, what we need to do is we put people to work. That is, we have the number of workers that increase to produce output. Then we actually can improve their skills. We upgrade labor skills by investing in what's called human capital. This is basically their education, skills training. Then we combine machinery, plants and equipment with these workers so that they can be productive using machinery. And the rest is basically the efficiency, the total overall efficiency of the economy, which we call total factor productivity. So this is a very basic accounting decomposition of how we get overall growth. You increase the number of people at work, you improve their education and their skills, you give them plants and equipment to work with, and then you allocate these resources, the workers and the capital that they work with, in a way that's going to maximize the overall efficiency. Okay? So this last term, the TFP, sort of this broad measure of productivity, is really a mixture of both the increased efficiency in resource use, as for example, how efficient or innovative a particular enterprise is, but it's also a measure of how efficiently are the economy's resources allocated across different activities at different levels of productivity. And that second element of TFP is something that I'm going to be, the allocative, the structural element of are we allocating resources appropriately is something that I'm going to be coming back to over and over again. We can distinguish this broad measure of total factor productivity from another measure of productivity, which is called labor productivity, and that's simply basically is a measure that takes into account the overall skills of labor and the amount of capital that they work with. So it's a narrower measure of productivity, but more closely linked with the GDP, gross domestic product. So we have two different measures of productivity, labor productivity and total factor productivity. And let's look at the same picture that I showed you from the perspective of productivity per se. So this is the same picture, just to remind you of the previous one. This was the trend for GDP, and this is really where Peru really stands out. And now we're looking at labor productivity. Just looking at labor productivity, once again, Peru is the thick blue line. What I see when I look at it is two things basically. One is that first, in terms of labor productivity, the performance is not nearly as distinguished as it was with respect to overall GDP. So what that is telling me is a lot of that GDP is basically by putting more people to work rather than necessarily making them more productive. But the second, that's sort of the negative part of it. The second is that if you look at it, you can see that sometime around the 2000s, early 2000s, really the labor productivity starts to take off. So it seems like there's really two different periods here. That after the early 2000s labor productivity performance, if you look at the slope of this increase in labor productivity, that's the growth rate, that has been actually fairly decent. Not as good as China and some of the other East Asian countries, but certainly better than Latin America as a whole. And sort of it looks like Peru is a productivity champion in terms of Latin America. The picture actually looks considerably worse when then finally we look at this other measure of productivity, total factor productivity. And total factor productivity is a measure of productivity of labor and capital taken together, and the overall efficiency. And here we see that, in fact, the overall trend, if these numbers are to be believed, because remember, TFP, the way that it's calculated is really just as a residual, so we don't really have a very good handle of it. So I would say take this with a grain of salt, but still, it's a bit of it's disturbing to see that the trend since 1990 is overall actually negative. That overall productivity growth has not been very good. And from the early 2000s, you see an increase, but then a stabilization and somewhat downward trend also still in the years just recent few years. So in fact, in this picture, Peru looks the worst in these sort of four different fourfold classification. Again, TFP, I would put a little bit of grain of salt. I think perhaps I would put more emphasis on this labor productivity chart than the total factor productivity growth chart that I'm showing. But again, it's something to think about. Now, let's think a little bit more about how we achieve productivity. Where is this productivity going to come from? I want to distinguish between the way that we think about productivity in rich countries from the way we think about productivity in the developing countries or the emerging market or middle-income countries like Peru. Because it's important to make that distinction, because often we miss that in order to get productivity in a country like Peru, you will need to work on very different levers and policy instruments than in an advanced country. In an advanced country like the United States or Sweden or Germany, when we think about productivity, we're thinking really about innovation. We're really thinking about increasing the frontier in terms of R&D, in terms of new products and processes. These are countries that are already at the productivity frontier. The only way they can increase it is really by pushing that frontier further, which is through innovation. Now, in developing countries or middle-income countries, there's certainly some innovation too. All the firms, all the entities that are members of this association are also involved in innovation, in figuring out ways of reducing their costs and so forth. But that's only part of the overall productivity of an economy like Peru. It's only part because a lot of the growth in productivity in highly heterogeneous, dualistic economies like Peru, which is a developing country, comes from structural change, from moving resources, that's people and capital, from activities that are relatively low productivity to activities that are much higher productivity. So this is a matter of not simply absorbing new ideas and new technologies from the rest of the world. There are already firms that have absorbed those technologies. They're already at the frontier. The issue is about disseminating them within the country. It's about expanding the set of firms and activities that are already highly productive and highly successful. That is the issue of moving people in the context of Peru, for example, from informality to formality, from the countryside to the urban areas. From firms that are small and less productive to firms that are medium and larger and higher productive activities. The reason that that's such a big deal in a middle-income country like Peru is that these gaps in productivity across different types of activities is so much larger than in an advanced country. So we can look at it in a couple of different ways. One is to look at broad differences in sectoral productivity across different types of large sectors. So just look at here, there's 8 or 9 different sectors, and I compare relative productivity levels of different sectors to each other around an economy-wide average. So I compare now Peru to advanced economies, and the economy average for these Peru versus advanced economies is this straight line. What we see, for example, if you just look at manufacturing, which is the third set of columns. In manufacturing, if you look at the mature countries, the blue bar, it is true that manufacturing is on average a little bit more productive than everything else, or the average. But the gap is that much bigger for Peru. That is that manufacturing industries in Peru are so much more productive compared to the rest of the activities in Peru. Okay? The same is true in the reverse direction in agriculture. If you look at agriculture, advanced countries, productivity relatively lower than the average. But in Peru, it's much, much lower still. Okay? These are both symptoms of underdevelopment because there are such large differences in productivity activities across different sectors. But it's also a potential. It can be an engine for growth because you can get relatively cheap increase in productivity in the economy simply by moving people across these activities, by taking people from informal traditional agriculture to more formal agribusiness or more formal manufacturing kinds of industries. And that can be a very important source of overall productivity growth without really that much R&D and innovation, because it's really not about that. It's not about R&D, universities, and innovation. It's simply getting resources to go into the right kinds of sectors. So this is a comparison across broad sectors. We can also do the same kind of comparison to see how much productive heterogeneity there is, and therefore how much potential there is for productivity growth through reallocation and structural change by looking across firms, a much more disaggregated kind of look. So this is trying to get at the same kind of issue by looking at differences in productivity levels across firms. And here Peru is compared to a bunch of other countries, but let's just focus our attention to China, or I'm sorry, the United States, the one that's the very top. And the size of these bars is the difference between the most productive and the least productive firms. Okay? So when you look at the United States, it's about 3.5. So the most productive firms are about 3.5 times as productive as the least productive firms. But in Peru, it's more like 4.5. There's a much bigger gap. So this distribution is much bigger. So again, the same kind of message. There's very large unexploited gains from being able to move resources, labor in particular, towards the more active, towards the more productive kinds of firms. This is, it would take too long to explain each one of these two charts. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say that services in particular plays a very big role in driving this basic inefficiency of the economy, this productive heterogeneity in the economy. It is true that there is a lot of productive heterogeneity in manufacturing as well, but where it really stands out is in services. Not only that, is that also when you look over time, you see that over time, manufacturing does the reallocation relatively effectively, that in manufacturing, labor does tend to move from the less productive to the more productive firms. But that doesn't happen in services. In services, if anything, it's the opposite. It's the relatively smaller, more informal firms or the sector that tends to be the employment absorber. And that's where employment is going. So services is not only sort of a big part of the economy, it's also a big part of the productivity problem in Peru, not just in the sense that services are on average low productivity. That's not the issue. It's that there are so many low productivity firms in services alongside some very high productivity ones as well. Now, in light of that, the issue about sort of how well manufacturing, how well industry is doing as a whole, is an immediate question that comes to mind. So one thing that would make a big contribution to this positive, productivity increasing, productivity enhancing structural change in Peru would be precisely more industrialization. Getting people from other sectors, both informal services as well as traditional agriculture, the countryside, into manufacturing. That would be one way in which you can generate productivity increase in the economy as a whole. But as you know, the news has not been very positive, that despite a manufacturing industry that is on the whole very productive, manufacturing not only remains small, but actually has been, certainly in employment terms, has been deindustrializing. That is to say that there's fewer and fewer people as a share of the total economy's employment that is employed in manufacturing. Now, can this process be reversed? I want to be just very upfront here when we talk about sort of what can be done to reindustrialize or to reverse this process of deindustrialization. I want to be very clear that I think it's going to be very difficult, because this process of deindustrialization, or what I've called premature deindustrialization in many contexts, is a global phenomenon. Furthermore, it's a secular trend that has been going on for quite some time. And it's driven by determinants that are not specific to Peru. They're really actually driven by global conditions. Three in particular. One is that manufacturing industries are becoming increasingly skill and capital intensive, which means that many middle-income countries, and certainly low-income countries, find that they have less and less comparative advantage in large chunks of manufacturing. There are only a few bits and pieces of manufacturing where they are able to make that technological leap that those can survive. But it's very difficult to sustain large manufacturing sectors based on relatively low skill, low wage workers, because manufacturing technology has really moved to a different stage, much more advanced skill stage already. So that's number one, is that the technological, it's a global phenomenon that's making it much more difficult for middle-income and low-income countries to actually sustain a lot of manufacturing. There is, of course, the phenomenon of global competition, countries like Peru are very open to trade. And it's very difficult to foster a lot of manufacturing for domestic market consumption. And there are quite, especially when you have countries like China and a few others that already have made very large inroads in the markets for manufacturing. And the third is that there is a global shift in demand as the world as a whole becomes richer. Demand patterns tend to move away from goods towards services. So what you have is, on the whole, the global market for manufactured goods is also shrinking relative to services, and services are not very tradable. So you have, for these three reasons, what you have is essentially that a phenomenon that we see everywhere, a difficulty of sustaining a lot of industry, and a process of deindustrialization that sets in very early. So one way to think about it is to look at the way that manufacturing normally evolves over the course of development. And whether you look at output or you look at employment, it tends to exhibit a kind of a reverse or inverse U-shaped pattern.
which is that as countries, so on the horizontal axis you have the income level, and in the vertical axis you have the economy-wide share of manufacturing, either employment or output. So as countries go from being poor to becoming less poor and to middle income, the share of manufacturing first rises, and then the industrialization begins to set in. That is, that there is a trend of a reversal. Now, first of all, where is Peru here? Peru is right about at the top. In fact, in terms of employment, it's beyond the peak. So in terms of this overall. So by cross-national benchmarks, Peru, it would seem as if Peru has industrialized as much as it possibly can. And that's not even the whole story, because this picture, these curves are for sort of an average over the last few decades. If we look at more recent decades compared to older decades, what we find is that this curve, these curves, have been shifting down and down and down and down every successive decade. So this is what the next chart shows. So this is the share of what has happened to the share of employment in manufacturing every decade. And every decade you can see that it's moved down and down and down. So this is after you control for all everything else that drives this trend. Okay? And there are two groups of countries, the left panel and the right panel. And the right panel are the countries that are actually strong exporters of manufacturers. And the panel on the left is everybody else. So the countries that are strong exporters of manufacturers have lost a little bit less employment than the rest, but they too have lost employment. So when we turn to output, right, the countries that are strong exporters of manufacturers have barely managed to keep their manufacturing output levels. That's sort of output, manufacturing value added at constant prices as a share of GDP. But other countries that are not already strong exporters of manufacturers because they have comparative advantages, say like Peru in natural resources, every decade they've gone down and down and down. So these are the headwinds that one would have to contend with when one is talking about reindustrialization. It's going to be extremely difficult. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't a need and useful room for productive development policies and industrial policies of the type that I will briefly talk about at the end. But it just means that we need to have a different perspective on what is it that we're trying to achieve. I think we go back to the chart that I showed you where now employment in manufacturing in Peru is below 10% of total employment. That's not going to go back up to 15%, 16%, 17%. That's going to be unrealistic. However, there could be pockets of strength, niches of technological and competitive success that provide benefits not only to manufacturing but to the economy as a whole, and provide vitality. So there are certain segments of manufacturing that can still be particularly strong drivers of growth. Okay? So the negative message from my presentation, if you will, is the pessimistic message, if you will, is that even with the best kind of a policy framework, I think we cannot expect policy to work miracles. It's going to be very, very different, very, very difficult to engineer a genuine reversal in this trend of deindustrialization. But as I just said, good policy can help, has a role to play. So let me turn now to discussion about sort of what kind of policy might play, what kind of a relationship between the public sector and the private sector might be appropriate given what I've already said. Now, there is, if you pick up any kind of a report that has anything to do with productivity from the multilateral institutions, whether it's the IDB or the World Bank or the OECD, and you sort of you look at what do they say about how do you improve productivity, what kind of policies, and you will get a list that's sort of like this, and a picture that sort of looks like what's on the right-hand side, and this really summarizes the existing approach to productivity. So briefly, well, we need to increase innovation, okay, but it's not everything as I said, but at least it's part of it. How do you increase innovation? Again, the standard remedies, you have to improve market competition, you have to increase R&D spending, you have to invest in schools and training, emphasize non-traditional agriculture, you enhance infrastructure, that's roads, ports, energy, and everything else. And then, of course, you have to improve governance, which is having essentially better regulation, more accountable governance, and so forth. Okay? So these are sort of the critical pillars of an overall strategy to increase productivity in the economy. Now, the problem is that either if you're a government or you're, let's say, an industry association and trying to sort of think these issues through with the government, something like what I've just shown you is not very useful, because it's basically everything under the sun. It's the kitchen sink. It's sort of like saying, as I say here, that if you want to become Sweden, you have to look like Sweden. Which is fine, but it doesn't really help me in terms of how do I get there? What is it, the steps that I have to take? Because all this list of what you have to do is basically the things that the successful countries do now, after they've become successful. But how do they get there? And how would a country like Peru, what might that country do on the way there? Okay? So it's not very helpful to say improve institutions, improve your schools, improve your infrastructure, because if there was an easy way of doing all of this, you would not have been developed. You would not have been you would already have been developed. So the question is, what do you do now with the workforce that you have, with your existing capabilities? A second and related problem with this kitchen sink approach, or the laundry list approach, is that it's not very well targeted. It's sort of, again, very broad. Any of you, of course, sort of work in the real world with real firms, real businesses, know that the problems and the obstacles you face are highly specific to the lines of business you are. It's a specific line of the tax code, it's a specific regulation, it's a specific labor market issue, it's a specific need with regard to training, it's a specific requirement on the infrastructure front. So these are highly specific things that aren't necessarily well addressed by these sort of generic programs of trying to do everything at once. So there's necessarily, therefore, you need a way of thinking about how do you set priorities, how do you think about setting priorities. So here, there is two styles of policy that we see countries engaging in. And I will, at the risk of some broad and crude generalization, I'm going to label the first approach, sort of the Latin American approach, or the multilateral development banks approach. And the second approach, sort of the pragmatic East Asian kind of approach. Okay, so already, you know which one I tend to favor. But the first approach tends to be, once again, rather general purpose, top-down, and presumptive in the sense of that you can presume what the problems are, what the priorities are, from relatively high-level analysis. So typically, these kinds of approaches are going to focus on deregulation and cutting red tape. The way that they're going to identify where to target is going to be through comparative benchmarking. So you look at, for example, World Bank doing business indicators, or you look at World Economic Forum competitiveness indicators, and you figure out where you're an outlier. Where you're an outlier suggests an area of priority. That's what you're trying to fix. Okay? And in this line of policy, then the way that the government works, the government relates to the private sector, is essentially it becomes a provider of a package of predetermined services. So there's an agency that provides or subsidizes for skill training. There are agencies that provide credit. There are sort of, an arm of the Treasury that provides tax exemptions. There is a marketing agency or an investment promotion agency that provides marketing assistance and so forth. So there's a list of agencies that provide a package of predetermined services, but this is relatively disconnected from the actual needs on the ground, because there has never been an actual analysis of what do current and potential exporters actually need, because those are going to be highly specific. The second approach is much more driven by the existing problems on the ground. Doesn't presume that we know what the problems are and what are the services that need to be provided correspondingly by the government, and therefore it's necessarily experimental. That there's an understanding that there's a bit of trial and error in this approach that's necessarily involved. And we'll try to figure out what the obstacles are and binding constraints are a little bit through this repeated method of we try something, we try, and if it doesn't work, we'll monitor, then we'll sort of revise. So there's this interactive element to this. But what drives this process is always a questioning, direct question of what the problem is. What's blocking new activities from emerging? What's blocking modern firms from expanding? Why is this firm that employing 7,000 people, why is that firm not employing 10,000 people, 15,000 people? What's blocking that? So in this mode of policy, governments are no longer sort of providing a package of predetermined services. They're much more agencies that are involved in an interactive process with the private sector and solving collective problems, solving problems for the private sector and trying to figure out what they can do to assist them. Now, this is extremely important for not just the government, but it's also extremely important for the government's counterpart, the private sector, because the way that the private sector, or for example as the SNI, to take the current example, how does the SNI think about how it relates to the government and what it wants for the government? So these two modes of how the private and the public sectors interact have very different implications for how the private sector is going to organize itself, for how it interacts with the public sector. Organizing around these very specific contextual problems is very different than organizing around sort of these broad general purpose policies such as taxes or general bureaucratic red tape. Now, I think in the history of this country itself, I think there is a lot of experience with how some of these elements of different types of programs have been implemented, and how some, in fact, have produced successes. We know that one of the key successes in Peru in terms of diversification and generation of non-traditional new export industries has been agribusiness, with asparagus being a phenomenal success. And the success of agribusiness, in fact, was fundamentally the result of private-public sector collaboration. Public investment during the 1990s in irrigation was extremely important. And furthermore, there were things that were done, as I think was mentioned earlier in one of the panels this morning. There were things that was done that specifically removed obstacles binding constraints to the expansion of a commercial, non-traditional agricultural sector, such as relaxing land use restrictions, various reductions in corporate tax rates, a new labor regime that was actually very different, that allowed for flexible labor use. And that actually, the package of all of this in the end actually did produce quite significant successes and it's continuing to produce some successes in non-traditional agriculture and agribusiness. There's the more recent experience of these working groups, the mesas executivas, which were these working groups that were organized in the previous administration, which were explicitly informed by this way of thinking about policy, which is that, let's get the private sector at a very disaggregated branch level working with government officials to identify what the bottlenecks are and to focus on removing those in a way that where the uncertainty was built into the process, that it was understood that much would be learned during execution. Pierre Ghezzi was the minister at the time, has written very insightfully about this process. And some of the critical elements of this process are actually quite interesting. That is that there's an explicit delineation of what's your problem and what's my problem. That it's not just that the private sector keeps making demands on the government, it's also that the private sector identifies what are the problems and the challenges that it will solve in return for the public sector addressing some of the things that what the government can do. So I think what's critical here is the ability of the private sector to identify some of the root problems specific to their domain and beyond the generic ones, such as high taxes or high cost of energy and so forth. So there is this residue of experience that's already built in and on which I think a country like this can move forward. As I was thinking about this experience, it struck me quite curious that many of these successes in diversification has actually taken place in agribusiness. And then I thought about sort of other Latin American cases, and it seemed to be a fairly common phenomenon that, we talk about industrialization and so forth, but actually some of the most notable successes of diversification in Latin America has actually come in agribusiness. And so the question is, why? And is there something that actually one could learn from this success in moving resources into agribusiness in other sectors as well, in industry in particular? So I think there are a number of things, a number of advantages that agribusiness typically has had. So one, of course, is that you have to have a latent comparative advantage in order to be eventually successful. And many of these sectors agribusiness sectors that became successful, such as asparagus, because of the peculiarities of the growing season, the climate, and so forth, that this was an area where Peru had a latent comparative advantage and therefore could develop very rapidly once the irrigation and other public services and other legal regime was sufficiently conducive. Second, and this is again, I think it's important that earlier I said that successful examples always involve the private sector being able to figure out its own problems and figure out what it has to do too. It's not simply just a one-sided demands on the government and the public sector all the time. And what strikes me about some of these, again, I give the asparagus example because that's the one that I've read about most, where it's quite clear that there's something about the social capital of some of these industries, that some of the early growers, some of the early entrepreneurs that provided significant public inputs to their industry as well, both by undertaking experimentation that became later available to other growers as well. But these early visionary producers produce significant benefits. And the question is, is there a similar kind of social capital in other branches of the economy as well, in particular industry as well. Third, I mentioned before that the agribusiness takeoff was facilitated by special policy regimes. And I think there's something about agribusiness that perhaps enabled the creation of different rules on corporate taxation, on labor, and so forth, that enabled these regimes, these special advantages for agribusiness in a way that you cannot do it for manufacturing industry. Or perhaps you can when you think about industrial parks, because after all, industrial parks about which we had a discussion we heard about in the morning are precisely an attempt to provide differential policy benefits or infrastructural advantages to firms that locate in these parks. Perhaps technologies travel easier in agriculture than in manufacturing. This goes back to an early point that I made, because in agriculture, basically you can import the technology and all you need is the local climate and the local soil. Whereas in manufacturing, you actually need to complement our skilled labor and skilled managers, and that's not in plentiful supply in most middle-income countries. And finally, the World Trade Regime treats manufacturing and agriculture differently. You have generally much more leeway in how you can, the policies you can implement in export-oriented agriculture industries that you can with respect to manufacturing. Or in other words, there's much more constraints, much more externally imposed constraints in manufacturing than in agriculture. And perhaps that has facilitated experimentation in agriculture on the part of the government in a way that's been ruled out in manufacturing industries. So I think putting all of this together, I think the kind of approach to sort of modern or new industrial policy, now when I talk about industrial policy, I don't mean just manufacturing, I mean all modern, non-traditional areas of production with relatively high productivity. The way that sort of an approach is built on for the conduct of this modern industrial policy, or sometimes it's called productive development policy. There's essentially three critical features, and I just want to summarize those before I close. And I call these institutional design features because they can be implemented, concretized in a number of different ways, but I think it's extremely important to